And the recording started, Miranda, so I would say
All right.
take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay. So I wanted to tell you all a little bit about Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay. We are a Wild Ones chapter located in Southern Maryland, serving Charles, Calvert, St. Mary's, Prince George's, and Anne Arundel counties. And the mission here is to connect people and native plants for a healthy planet through our passion to educate, advocate, and collaborate to support Wild Ones' vision of native plants and natural landscapes thriving in every community. We want to promote the use of native plants through local and national educational programs. Wild Ones National has 99 chapters and 49 seedlings in 38 states across the country. And here are some of the chapters we have in Maryland. Chesapeake Bay, which is our chapter. There's Delmarva, Greater Baltimore, Greater Frederick, and Nation's Capital Region. So if you aren't a Wild Ones member already and you're interested in joining, you can see which of these chapters is closest to you and think about joining. Right now, our Chesapeake Bay chapter has 75 active members and we are growing. You can see down here our graph of which counties all of our members come from. The mission of Wild Ones is to promote native landscapes through education, advocacy, and collaborative action. And we want to connect people and native plants for a healthy planet. And our vision is native plants and natural landscapes thriving in every community, which I'm sure pretty much everybody here would agree with is a very important thing. Some of our core values are respect, which is respect for each other and respect for the earth. We are inclusive. We want to have diverse voices and backgrounds as a part of our organization. We strive to provide evidence-based information. And we are action and growth oriented, meaning that we like to actually go in and do the work to support our mission. And tonight, I am so pleased to introduce everybody to our guest, Kerry Wixted. Kerry is a vegetation ecologist at the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. She is a total nature nerd who loves sharing her knowledge and passion through education and outreach. Kerry is a beloved and well-respected member of the naturalist community, providing excellent education materials for the public, leading nature walks, and giving talks like this one that we are going to hear tonight about charismatic carnivorous plants. So without further ado, I present Kerry Wixted.
Thanks, Miranda.
Love
So welcome again. My name is Kerry Wixted. I'm the vegetation ecologist with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission in Prince George's County. So we've got a really, really long title here. And I'm very excited to talk about carnivorous plants and some of the species that you can find here in Maryland, as well as on some of our properties within the commission. So carnivorous plants seem like something out of a science fiction novel, and I saw folks like Dave Bender comment about his love of things like Little Shop of Horrors, and there are also some great horror movies like The Day of the Triffids, you know, these man-eating plants. They're not as sinister to people, but they are to invertebrates, essentially. And it's really wild to think about the evolution of these specialized feeding structures that they have and their strategies. And it was really Charles Darwin that brought to light this adaptation. So once he discovered carnivore plants, he literally was obsessed. And since his discovery, we now know that carnivory has evolved multiple times over 140 million years, including independently arising at least 12 different times in the plant world. So really fascinating how that, what we call convergent evolution, has occurred due to some of the constraints of the environments these plants live within. So let's start with a little trivia. How many carnivorous plants do you think are found in the world, at least species that have been described? Give me some ballpark numbers. And then how many you might think would be found here in Maryland? So type in a few numbers that you think in the chat. Some wide ranges there. 15 worldwide, 5 in Maryland, 300 species, 40 in Maryland, 500 in the world, 200, 7, 50 and 25. All right. Well, Jen, it's kind of the closest to the worldwide estimate. We're looking at just over 860 species that have been described around the world. And then here in Maryland, we've got about 20. So pretty surprising. And you've probably walked by some. Actually, I'm going to say if you've been hiking in Maryland, you have walked by some and you probably haven't realized it. And we're also finding out that some of these species have been sneakily carnivorous and we didn't even realize in our midst. So this is a Western false asaphadel. We have an Eastern species here in Maryland as well that's rare. And this Western species, researchers just realized in 2021 that it not only was capturing invertebrates, but also digesting them. So it was exhibiting carnivory and it was just kind of there in plain sight and nobody realized. So there's still things to discover out and about, even here in the United States. So unfortunately, around 25% of our carnivorous plants are considered rare, threatened, or endangered. And those are out of the species that we know and also the species that we studied. There's quite a few understudied species, particularly in some of the tropical, subtropical areas where you see high densities of these carnivorous plants. And this graphic just kind of gives you a breakdown of the rarity of certain genuses of these carnivorous plants across the globe, with the rarest being the Philcoxias, which are found down in Brazil. They're actually in the plantain family, which is kind of wild to think about. Carnivorous plantains, well, they're in the plantain family, but apparently they have similar trapping mechanisms to the bladderworts that can be found here in Maryland. So why the heck did plants decide to be carnivorous? And I say, why not, right? Free food is free food. And as I mentioned earlier, this has evolved multiple times. It's not a single plant lineage that has evolved carnivory. And so essentially it was a response to these harsh environments that these plants have to grow in. Typically, we see these carnivorous plants in areas that have low nutrients with ample sun, or in areas where there's high competition for nutrients that might be limited in availability. So they had to get a little creative about how they were able to capture some of that food. And so the three main things that makes a species carnivorous is they have to be able to capture the prey, they have to digest it, and they also have to absorb the nutrients from that prey. And sometimes we'll see combinations of maybe one, two, or all three of those traits across the plants. And there was actually a research paper in 2009 that suggested that petunias might actually be carnivorous. And essentially what they realized was petunias, when you look closely, and if you've ever touched petunias, you've probably felt how sticky they are. Well, folks were realizing that they were very sticky and they had insects attached to them. So that was the question: is they're capturing and killing these things, but are they digesting and absorbing it? And further analysis revealed that they were just kind of using it as essentially a deterrent to prevent insect predators from consuming the plants. So it's believed that some of these carnivorous plant traps actually evolved first as defensive structures, and then they realized that they could also be used, adaptively for trapping mechanisms to feed themselves. And there are costs to carnivory, and so you can look at prey capturing leaves versus photosynthetic ones. Typically, prey capturing leaves, you're going to use less resources to create them because they require less chlorophyll. But when you have less chlorophyll, you have less ability to photosynthesize and get your nutrients from the sun. So researchers have looked at how you can kind of change the cost dynamics, the energy cost dynamics with some of these plants. And there was actually a study that was done with cultivar of these Nepenthes, and essentially what they did was they looked at how these leaves, these trapping leaves were formed just naturally and versus with plants that have been fertilized. And interestingly enough, when the plants form their trapping pitchers without the fertilizer and were given fertilizers later on, you see more of that reddish coloration and all of that associated with the leaves and less of the chlorophyll associated with photosynthesis. But if they were fertilized before these trap structures were formed, then they tended to be greener and have more chlorophyll. So essentially, this is a response of not having enough nitrogen in the soil. They're using that to create these pitchers that are going to be attractive to insects and other types of invertebrates to consume to get that nitrogen. But if they have that nitrogen, then they're going to try to use that to photosynthesize and do what most other plants do. In the world of carnivorous plants, there are two ways to kind of catch food. One is to actively grab your food, and that includes things like our iconic fly traps and some of the trapdoor plants like the bladderworts and the alivandras. They use like sophisticated active trapping mechanisms that capture things. And then we have others like our pictures and our papers that more are passive about, hey, something comes and flies and gets stuck to me, don't mind if I do. And an example of a passive trap is this thing called a butterwort. These species are found to the south of us. I think I don't know if there are any butterworts in Virginia, but definitely in North Carolina and points south, you can start to see the butterworts. And they're literally like fly trap paper. And so they sit on the ground and just wait for things to come and stick to them. So that's their structure there. Of course, these plants are also using invertebrates to help with pollination. And so it's really important to separate business from pleasure because you don't get very far if you're eating your pollinators, right? So many of these plants have evolved spatial, temporal, and physical ways or barriers to prevent consuming their pollinators. It's not fail-safe, but it's an attempt to separate some of the eating from the pollinating. And so a lot of our local plants, you'll see that the flower structures are way, way above the eaten structures, essentially. And then sometimes the flower structures are attracting a different type of organism, like the white flowers might be attracting things like flower flies and all of that, whereas the eating structures might be attracting a different type of organism. So that's one of those like physical kind of separates that prevents them from eating the pollinators. So the Venus flytrap is probably the most well-known carnivorous plant around the world. And there's only one species in this genus. And it's only found in a very, very tiny section of coastal North Carolina and some parts of South Carolina. So this species is closely related to our sundews, and you can really see that reflected in the flower structure when I show you some pictures of our sundews a little bit later. But we don't have any Venus flytraps here in Maryland except for in cultivation. Sadly, we see millions of Venus flytraps in cultivation, but declining numbers in wild. And it's estimated that there's less than 36,000 left in the wild. And unfortunately, they're still getting poached. And I just posted an article in the Wakelet from this past fall, where a spot that is well known for their flytraps has had plants poached yet again. So these are active traps, and these have really, really fascinated Darwin. So inside those they're actually modified leaves. They have these little trigger hairs, and so essentially it takes a couple touches to those trigger hairs really to get them to react. And plants don't have nervous systems. It's all like biochemical responses that they're doing and reacting upon. But essentially, if an organism comes in and touches a trigger hair, one of those trigger hairs on the inside of the trap gets touched, it primes the plant and gets it ready. It releases essentially chemicals to help it be able to close. And if a second trigger hair is kind of hit within a certain amount of time, that is going to cause that trap to snap shut. And it can snap shut pretty fast. It takes 100 milliseconds to trap its prey. And then what happens is when that prey is trapped in there, the more that prey struggles, the more it hits the trigger hairs, and the more trigger hairs that are engaged, the more of the essentially digestive enzymes that are released by that fly trap. So essentially, the more you struggle, the more chemicals are released to eat you, essentially. And Janet, yes, plants don't have muscles, so it is a chemical pathway that is essentially convincing, or not convincing, but directing the plant to do this closure. So it's triggered, and then all these chemicals get released, and that causes it to be able to close. So there's one of the researchers who looked at how these traps close and how they release more of the digestive enzymes and all of that. The more with struggle is a deadly spiral of capture and disintegration, essentially. Locally, we don't have Venus flytraps, but we do have a plant that has what I feel is a more sophisticated trapping mechanism, and that's our bladderworts, utricularias. This is one of the largest groups of carnivorous plants around the world. There are about 200 species that have been identified, and we have about I think 12. Well, I have a slide, but I think there's 12 here in Maryland. And this is the only plant with a true trapdoor. So this is typically an aquatic or semi-aquatic plant. And they have these little air-filled bladders that you can see in the upper right-hand side of the screen. And they have these little trigger hairs. And essentially, when a microorganism hits those trigger hairs, it causes that bladder, it's an air-filled bladder, and it literally vacuums the organism inside. And this is 1/30th of a second to trigger that reaction. So it's even faster than the Venus flytrap. And this is all, again, kind of plant hormones and trigger hairs that are guiding all of this. And they're sucking things inside. So yes, we have 12 bladderwort species here in Maryland, and 6 of them are considered to be rare, threatened, or endangered. And typically our bladderworts are going to be found in slow-moving bodies of water, so in lakes and ponds, and sometimes right along muddy shores. And this is a species that I can almost guarantee you've walked by and not realized that it was a carnivorous plant. And one of the tip-offs for me is I usually see random little yellow flowers sticking from the water. And if you look closely, you'll notice that those yellow flowers are usually attached to these aquatic leaves that have all of these little bladders on them. So one of our rare species in Maryland is swollen bladderwort, which is right over here on the left. This has a very unique floating leaf structure when it's flowering, so it looks like a little wheel, and it has these larger yellow flowers. And so this is a species we just discovered a new population of in one of our parks in the northern part of Prince George's County. So I'm really excited about that. It wasn't really too much of a surprise because it's close to another known location, but we just didn't have documentation of it. So I was happy to see that. But again, most of our bladderworts here in Maryland are going to have these yellowish flowers. So that will be your tip-off there. Probably our most common bladderwort that we have in the state is humped bladderwort. And so it has this flower, and it has this larger upper corolla lip. And so the corolla is like all of the petals together as one unit. And so it has this this bigger lip there on it. It also has these little leaf-like branches that are coming off that are 5 to 15 millimeters long, and so you will see the little yellow flowers and then the extra leaves that come up with those flowers, and that is a good tip-off that you're probably looking at humped bladderwort. Most of these species are going to be flowering in June and July. Some of them flower at end of May. So we saw some of this bladderwort at Lake Artemisia, which is one of our properties. I think it was this one, or it might have been the other common bladderwort, but we found that at the end of May out in the water. The purple bladderwort is unique among Maryland's bladderworts because it has a purple flower. This is also a state threatened species and is primarily found in the Delmarva Bays, those kind of temporary wetland habitats that you'll find over on the eastern shore of the state. Now, interestingly enough, this species is starting to become more herbivorous than, or I should say omnivorous than carnivorous. And so researchers, when they were examining some of the trap contents of purple bladderwort, they were noticing a lot of algae that they were finding in the plant or in those bladders. And when they started looking a little bit further, they realized that it essentially was a mutualistic relationship between the algae and the purple bladderwort. Essentially, the bladderwort was giving the algae a free, safe place to stay and live. And in exchange, the algae was photosynthesizing and providing nutrients to that purple bladderwort in exchange for housing. So that also decreased the amount of invertebrates that these bladderworts were catching to consume and everything. So really fascinating stuff. And I forgot to mention too earlier that these bladders and for the bladderworts, the little bladders, have their own microbial communities. And so they have things like predatory protist, bacteria, algae, like in the case of the purple bladderwort, and other types of microorganisms that exist within those bladders outside of the things that they're eating, like the single-celled rotifers or little water fleas like Daphne and all of that. And as far as the questions go, in terms of growing in brackish water, the purple bladderwort does not grow in brackish water. It's freshwater. I don't know if there are any brackish water species of bladderworts in Maryland. And then the bladders, they sort of help the plant float because they're filled with oxygen and other gases. And so you'll often see them floating as this mat. And a lot of times people will write them off as looking like a big mat of brown algae on the water. But if you look closely, you'll see those little bladders in the mix along with the little dissected leaves that they have. Moving along to the sundews, these are some of our tiniest carnivorous plants here in the state and around the world. So there are about 180 species that have been described, and they've been found on all 6 of the 7 continents, so everywhere except for Antarctica. They have this gel-like substance on the leaves. They're actually kind of gland-tipped hairs, and those hairs are really the colors and the scents of those hairs are what's attracting things to these sundews. And they use proteases and phosphatases to help break down and digest the different organisms that they catch. So on the screen, you can see pink sundew, which is found here in Maryland. This is one of our rare sundews. This picture is down in North Carolina. I've never seen this in the state, but you can see that next to my fingers how tiny these things are and how this sandy environment, you probably can imagine, doesn't really provide much in the way of nutrition, which is why they have to be able to capture their prey to be able to consume. And then the pink sundew, unlike most of the other sundews around, has little pink flowers where everybody else typically has white, at least here in Maryland. And I forgot to mention too, while the sundews are more passive and wait for things to kind of stick to them, they will slightly bend. And the threadleaf sundew, which I don't have pictured on this screen, that tends to, it has a long kind of leaf, and that will bend a little bit more slowly. It's not really bending to capture the organism, it's just bending to hold on to it better. So here in Maryland, we have 5 species of sundews. The most recently found one is this dwarf sundew, which was found only probably in the last 4 or 5 years here in Maryland. There's one introduced species, that's the threadleaf sundew, that used to be found at Suitland Bog in Prince George's County, one of our properties, but it hasn't been seen for a while. And that likely got introduced to Suitland Bog when the pitcher plants were introduced from New Jersey into the bog. 3 of the 5 species of sundews here in Maryland are considered to be rare. I showed you the pink sundew, that is a state endangered plant. We have round-leaved sundew, which is a state watch list species. So that means it's not quite like super rare, but it's on the way. And this has more of these rounded leaves that are much wider than they are long. Whereas the common sundew that is often found in these sphagnous habitats, this is sphagnum moss that typically is a very acidic environment. So the spatulate leaf sundew has more of these long leaves like spoons, so hence the name spatulate. And this is a species that is surprisingly found more across the state than you might realize, but it's super, super tiny. It's like the diameter of a quarter, so you can really, really easily walk by it if you're not looking for it. I will say this time of year, the sundews are starting to flower, so they'll have these, again, those stalks that are going to be up above the eaten parts, and they're going to have little white flowers. And when you see those little white flowers, that helps make it a lot more obvious out and about to see it, because a lot of times those leaves are almost tucked into the sphagnum moss. Moving along to pitcher plants, these are the largest carnivorous plants that we have around the world, and they're split into 2 main groups. We have the old world pitcher plants, which are the Nepenthes, the big kind of hanging pitchers that you might be familiar with, particularly in the plant trade. And then we have the new world pitcher plants, the Sarracenias, which are exclusive here to North America. And so these things rely on nectar, hair, and enzymes essentially to attract and digest, or attract, capture, and digest their prey. And just like with the purple bladderwort, some of these things are not carnivorous at all. In fact, the largest pitcher plant species in the world, Nepenthes raja, found over in southeastern Asia, eats poop. Specifically, it eats tree shrew poop. And so right there in the center, you can see this plant. It has this modified leaf, the hood essentially, and it secretes kind of a sugary nectar that attracts the little tree shrew that you can see here on the picture. And it is conveniently shaped like a toilet. So as the tree shrew eats some of the nectar from the Nepenthes, it will poop inside the plant and the plant will digest the feces. Interestingly enough, there is another Nepenthes also found in southeastern Asia in, I believe this one's in Borneo. And this species, we knew for a long time that bats roosted in those pitchers, but we didn't know that the pitchers were, we thought it was a one-sided relationship, that these little bats, it's Hardwick's woolly bat. It's super tiny little bat that eats insects. We just thought it was just utilizing the pitcher plants to be able to have a place to stay. Then researchers started looking into it, and they realized that that hood over the pitcher is actually specifically designed to help bats navigate to that pitcher better. So it is designed in a cup-like fashion that helps with those sonar, the sonar that bats use, the echolocation, helps them be able to navigate around and find the pitcher plants easier. And then when researchers started looking at the contents of the pitchers, they realized that it had bat poop in there, almost exclusively bat poop. And so this is another example of a poop eating plant. And so when I do programs for kids, I always talk about these because everybody laughs at poop in the child world. So this is always kind of a fun adaptation to talk about. Here in Maryland, we have two pitcher plant species, one that is native and one that's introduced. And pitcher plants, the Sarracenias, love to hybridize. So there's some potential in some of these areas where the yellow pitcher plants have been planted that they have hybridized with our native pitcher plants. So our native pitcher plant is northern pitcher plant, Sarracenia purpurea, and I'll talk a little bit more about its distribution and how it's designed on a few other slides. But notice that it's got more of a squat kind of vase structure. You can see those downward facing hairs that when invertebrates land on it, they slide down into that pitcher. But also notice that it is open and it allows it to essentially fill up with rainwater, which is different from a lot of other Sarracenias, including the yellow pitcher plant that you can see here. Yellow pitcher plants, they actually have this hood, and it tries to prevent some of that rainwater that gets down into that pitcher. So prevents the rainwater from essentially diluting those juices that are in those pitchers. And then some of the pitcher plants in North Carolina, like the hooded pitcher plants, completely block any rainwater from getting in. And I'll talk about a little bit why that matters when I get to some of the other slides. But I want to point out on the yellow pitcher plant here that they're typically these very tall, slender vases. So some of them can be like 2-3 feet tall. That picture of me with the pitcher plant was actually these yellow pitcher plants down in North Carolina. They can be yellowish in color. They can have red streaks to them, but they always have that big kind of hood over top of those vases. And so this picture all the way over here on the right is actually one of the suspected hybrids that I found in one of the locations where a yellow pitcher plant was planted here in Maryland. You can see that tall, skinny vase-like structure. It has a lot of the coloration of our northern pitcher plant, but then it has that hood that is much more reminiscent of the northern pitcher plant than of the yellow pitcher plant. So the yellow pitcher plant has been planted in a few areas in Maryland intentionally, and the northern pitcher plant has been planted in a few areas as well. So the northern pitcher plant is probably one of the most recognized pitcher plants, and that's probably because it has a really wide distribution, and it's the only species that can be found in northern climates here in North America. If you really, really want to see pitcher plants, you got to go to the southeastern United States and places like Alabama and Louisiana. They are like the pitcher plant capitals of probably, I mean, I shouldn't say the world, but they're the pitcher plant capitals for the New World pitcher plants, the Sarracenias. So this is what we have here. This species ranges all the way up into Canada, and it is essentially been adapted to survive in these peat bogs in these northern regions, and it's been here for at least 10 to 12,000 years since glaciation. So it also has been introduced to different areas. So it's while there are pitcher plants that are native out in California, this species it has been introduced to California, so it's naturalized in some sections of Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. So excuse me, as I said earlier, this is kind of different for most of the Sarracenias because it has that open pitcher that allows rainwater to get into it. And so essentially they fill with rainwater and so they need to figure out other ways to be able to effectively break down insects. And there's a whole microbial community that can be found inside the northern pitcher plant that I'll talk about in a second. But this is what these plants typically look like. This picture is of just a lone pitcher. You can have immense variation in the colors of the pitcher plants. Some of them can have lots of red. Some of them can be almost green. Sometimes you'll see single plants. More typically, you will see these kind of clumps of plants that all are from a single plant that have just been kind of growing out. And so you'll see those, and they're typically in these sphagnous areas, these seepage wetlands. We like to call them bogs here in Maryland, but technically we don't have any bogs. Everything that we have are considered to be fens, and that's because they're fed from groundwater instead of rainwater like you would see with bogs. Um, the pitcher plant flowers, they come up in, or they flower in May. They're the prettiest colors in late May. Some of them are almost neon red in appearance, and then you can still see them a little later in the season, but essentially they're done with flowering and all of that. But they've got some really fascinating flowers. And I've sniffed them. They don't really have much of a scent, but I have seen things like flies and stuff visit them. So as I said, there's a whole microbial community inside of these pitcher plants that allows them to break stuff down with those digestive juices that are essentially a little more diluted by the rainwater. And so one of the really cool relationships are these pitcher plant mosquitoes, Wyoming smithii, which are also rare in Maryland. And I call them the king of the castle. So the larvae of the pitcher plant mosquitoes will live inside these northern pitcher plants, and they essentially are the top dog, and they eat all sorts of other things that are also living in there, and they break those things down, and by breaking it down, it makes it easier for that pitcher plant to be able to digest the rest of the stuff. So there are rotifers, protozoa, and midges that can also be found within those pitchers, and then we have proteases and hydrolases that are breaking stuff down. And interestingly enough, we do see there are people who have looked at nitrogen content and also the pH of some of these pitchers, and I think they're surprisingly more alkaline than you would expect. And certainly in some of these areas where we have a lot of nitrogen deposition from pollution and things like that, you'll also see that reflected in what's happening in these pitchers. So pitcher plants and all these other things are really, really cool, but around the world, around 25% are declining. And that number is probably a little bit low just because there is a bias in some of our plant sciences of not having a lot of money for research and data. So there very likely are some species that aren't doing the best that we don't have accurate population data on to make those informed decisions about. So like many of our other species around the world, habitat loss and degradation are big for a lot of our carnivorous plants. And some of our carnivorous plants are rare just because they live in these very specialized habitats. And so they don't have their habitat specialists, they don't have a lot of flexibility on where they can live. And unfortunately, we do see things like climate change also impacting these species, or especially with like these wetland type species and these drier, hotter summers that we're getting, that can really affect some of these species. Some of the showier species and even some of the common ones are threatened by illegal collection. And then we also have to deal with invasive species in some of these sites as well. And there's also an invasive carnivorous plant. This one, water wheel, Aldrovanda, has actually been introduced into places like New Jersey, New York, and Virginia. And this essentially is almost like an aquatic Venus flytrap. So if you look at it, you can see those Venus flytrap-esque kind of leaves on it that also have those long trigger hairs and everything. And so you might think, oh, a non-native carnivorous plant, how can that be invasive? Well, what happens is these things can spread in some of these aquatic environments, and they can really alter the microbial communities in these wetland systems. And so, so this species has become problematic in certain areas like Fort Hill in Virginia, and a few other places. And unfortunately, it seems like some of the populations, particularly the Virginia population, might have been intentionally introduced. And so this species is one of these wild species where in its native habitat in like Eurasia, so like in Japan and Europe and all of that, it's listed as endangered. It's not doing very well. And so it's also in the captive plant trade, the horticultural trade. And so people have seen it not doing well over in Eurasia, but they've introduced it here in North America, and it creates some of those ethical questions about some of these introductions and all of that. So as far as I know, we don't have it here in Maryland, but occasionally it has been found as a hitchhiker on some carnivorous plant shipments here in the state. So if you do get carnivorous plants from a nursery or places like that, just try to inspect them, because sometimes these things can be really small, and they can also be part of like the substrate or the water, and could accidentally get introduced with whatever else you're trying to grow. These are just some pictures of some of the habitat threats that I've seen throughout my career. So this area in Anne Arundel County used to have one of the largest natural pitcher plant populations in the state. And this is one of those seepage wetlands. It actually is a seepage, it was a groundwater seepage along the slope. So there was a steep slope. The groundwater kind of came up and fed this little boggy habitat on the edge of the hillside. And then the main water channel was almost separate from that. And in that boggy area is where the pitcher plants and sundews and all sorts of other species existed. And unfortunately, a beaver came in downstream, made a dam, and that caused that flooding upstream. So that main water in the channel got into that nutrient poor section of groundwater where this little mini bog was living. This was post flood, after the beaver dam had been broken up, and you can just see how much of this stuff was inundated. And things like the pitcher plants and the rare orchids that were found at this site, they did not do well with flooding. And so a majority of the pitcher plants and the orchids were wiped out post flood. Some of the other rare species, like there was a little shrub, leatherleaf, that seemed to do okay with the flooding, but other species just were not adapted to that. And so that became really difficult to watch this site. Now, over the years, there was work done to put one of those levelers through the dam and to maintain the water levels and all of that. And so you don't see that flooding that much anymore, but the damage was already done. And unfortunately, part of the other damage that happened with this flooding was upstream. There's some high nutrient sources that were coming down, and the flooding pushed all of those extra nutrients into the sensitive area. So we started seeing species like skunk cabbage, which is native, but it is something that aggressively grows and will shade out a lot of those rare plants that aren't used to having to compete with big plants like skunk cabbage. So that flooding really, really affected this system because of the extra nutrient inputs and a few other things. We've also seen some destruction to some of these areas. Like these were the headwaters in Charles County to a bog that has a large pitcher plant population. And unfortunately, in Maryland, and I think this is for a lot of states, you can protect wetlands, but you can't, there aren't really protections for the groundwater. And so because a lot of these habitats that support these rare plant species are these seepage groundwater fed wetlands, the lack of protection to the groundwaters and all of that can affect that, ultimately the hydrology of what's going into that wetland, and that could be detrimental to some of these sites. One of the sites that I help manage now is Suitland Bog, and this is part of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission's property here in Prince George's County. So it is found down in Suitland, Silver Hill. And this area is a little over 60 acres. It includes uplands and almost a 1 acre bog section that has carnivorous plants like the pitcher plant in it. And this area needs a lot of maintenance. And so not only do we have to manage the uplands for invasive species, we also have to manage woody plants that are invading that boggy area. This area is typically really open environment and all of that. And so you get these natural successional trees like red maple and tulip poplar, which are usually great in our forests, but they start seeding into those open areas of the bog, and we have to manually remove them. So this picture is some of my coworkers helping out with one of our removal days. We had folks out there for 3 hours in May, and we removed almost 20 yards of invasive plants and woody plant material just in 3 hours. So you can see me, I'm sitting here on top of the dumpster with a bunch of multiflora rose that I took out, but there was also a lot of invasive viburnums that we took out from the uplands so it doesn't get into the boggy areas. But this just is something to say that some of these habitats, we have so few of them left, that they also take intense management to maintain. And traditional management methods aren't always available in some of these sensitive habitats. Like you can't bring heavy equipment in to do plant removal or things like that. So we really need a lot of people power and people who know where to step and all of that to be able to help with that. Another threat to some of these carnivorous plants is loving them to death. And so we do have a lot of issues with illegal collection of carnivorous plants. And so it's happened here in Maryland, but some of the bigger issues that have been documented here in North America are usually in these places in North Carolina. Like this was taken at one of the parks that's well known for Venus flytraps. This area, they had just had like, I think 500 or 600 Venus flytraps that were repatriated. That essentially the poachers were caught and the plants were put back into the park where they were originally taken from. They just were repatriated, and I took these pictures in 2024, and apparently in fall of 2025, somebody else was back at the site and harvesting these plants. So if you are to buy some of these carnivorous plants, whether they be native or some of the non-natives, like even some of the rarer Nepenthes species, those big hanging pitcher plants and all of that, it's important to ask questions about how or where these were obtained from and try to figure out if they were sustainably sourced. For a lot of the Venus flytraps, I mean, there's so many in trade. It just blows my mind that that people are still harvesting them from the wild. And I almost wonder if it's because of these wild populations. These are slow to grow plants. And so it's easier to harvest these larger, big Venus flytraps than to wait the time frame that it needs, that you really need to get the little flytraps to be able to get to a big sellable size. So we've got the sustainable sourcing if you're going to be purchasing some of these things, but also thinking about planting them. And you really don't want to plant these in natural areas. So we have instances in parts of Maryland, including Suitland Bog, where someone from New Jersey back in the 60s said, hey, Suitland Bog and Cranesville Swamp, they look just like the New Jersey Pine Barren, but you don't have pitcher plants. Let me help you with that. And so they planted pitcher plants out in those areas. We have documentation of those, but like some of those yellow pitcher plant populations, we don't know where they came from. And so in some areas, they don't do a lot, but then sometimes these outplanted species, even if they're native, like the northern pitcher plants that were planted from New Jersey in Suitland Bog, are super aggressive compared to the ones that are naturally found in Maryland. And it makes me wonder if they're a different ecotype or a different subspecies, but we just haven't split them out yet. But you really don't want to put these things out in natural environments and have them spread into those areas. And then the final thing is also to if you're going to visit some of these sites, understand that a lot of these sites are very sensitive habitats. And so the ones that are open to the public, including places like Suitland Bog, often have boardwalks. And it's very important to stay on the boardwalks or stay on the trails and not to venture off, because there are a lot of little things on the ground. You can compact that soil, accidentally step on things, affect the seed banks and all of that. So it's really important to be respectful of those habitats if you're going to visit them. And so some places where you can safely view carnivorous plants, if you go all the way out to Garrett County, right there, technically most of Cranesville Swamp is in West Virginia, but this is a Nature Conservancy property. This is a picture of it. My favorite time of year to visit Cranesville is actually August and September, when it's getting ready. It's getting into its fall colors because it has a very slow growing season. It's a frost pocket bog. But it has sundews out there. There used to be those pitcher plants, but Nature Conservancy made the decision to do the removal of most of the pitcher plants. And I think there's one or two that will pop up every now and again. But you can see the sundews out there. And then if you go a little earlier in the season, in like June and July, you might be lucky to see some of the bladderworts that are out there. Down at Calvert Cliffs in Calvert County and some of those ponds leading out to the cliffs and the beach, that is where you can see some of the swollen bladderwort and a few other bladderwort species in June. So if you take a stroll out to go look for shark teeth in those areas, look for some yellow flowers poking from the water, and you might see some of those bladderworts. You can also come visit Suitland Bog down in Prince George's County. Our main gate, unfortunately, has to stay closed except for special events, just because of the amount of dumping that we see at the environment. But you can access it by parking at Suitland Community Center and walking in. And so I have these also listed on this Wakelet that I'll share right there, and I've got our page to Suitland Bog. And we do hold events every now and again. We just held the 50th anniversary, the 50th birthday of Suitland Bog for 50 years of managing it. And Miranda made this really cool bog day graphic for me. So yeah, keep an eye out for some of our events. We'll do guided nature hikes and all of that there. And you can learn about some of the unique plants that are found in those areas. If you want to travel, Cranberry Glades in West Virginia is a haul, but it is amazing because of all of the orchids and carnivorous plants. It also has it's only a 1 mile boardwalk, but I spent like hours there because I'm just a nerd. Canaan Valley's a little closer, so you can see stuff in Canaan Valley and Dolly Sod's about 3.5 hour drive from Annapolis. You can go up to Pennsylvania. And if you really, really want to go to the carnivorous plant mecca, go to the Green Swamp in North Carolina. So that's where I saw like 4 different, I think they have 5 species of pitcher plants, but I saw 4 of the 5 there. And then I saw the butterworts. I saw the, obviously the Venus flytraps, so like a bunch of sundews and all sorts of stuff. So it is amazing, but plan to spend several hours there on the less than like 2 mile trail. I love it. It's just the mecca, so go there. All right, and this is just what Suitland Bog looks like right now. So this is our boardwalk that you can walk around. It's not a very big spot, but this is our biggest pitcher plant location, and you can see some of the flowers in here. And we have been very dutifully cutting back a lot of vegetation in here. Naturally, we would have a fire sweeping through Suitland Bog and killing off those thin-barked trees like the red maples and all of that are trying to get in there, but we don't have fires raging through Prince George's County anymore. So now we have to bring in the clippers and all of that. So this is like one of the giant sphagnum mats that you can see, and you can see some of the pictures in there. It's just a really, really cool spot that's tucked away. If you want to help out carnivorous plants here in Maryland, there's actually relatively very little funding for rare plant conservation and management. But at tax time, you can check line 35 for the Chesapeake Bay and Endangered Species Fund. on your Maryland state taxes. Half that money goes to Chesapeake Bay Trust for their grant programs, but then the other half goes to the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Wildlife and Heritage Service. And they manage, all of the state's rare, threatened, and endangered species. And there are very, very few dedicated funds for rare plant work outside of this tax checkoff. I used to also preach about supporting Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or RAWA, at the national level. It came really, really close to passing, and it would have infused several $billions in dedicated funds towards conservation of rare species, including plants. They added plants in there, and it got nixed on the congressional floor a couple years ago, and it doesn't seem like it might come back anytime soon. But if you hear Recovering America's Wildlife Act again, or RAWA, or something similar, look into that, because that would have been a really big boon for a lot of rare species, not just rare plants. And so I'll open it up to questions from here. You can see my email there on the screen. There's me again in the green swamp with some of those yellow pitcher plants, the Mecca. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Carrie. This is such a cool topic. I took so many notes. Okay. Let's see, I guess, if there's anything in the chat. Any questions? You answered my question right there at the end, so.
Yeah, fire, and there's some thoughts that some large grazers also helped keep some of these areas open. So we had like the woodland bison and the elk here in Maryland and some other areas. So so they might have also helped with some of those environments.
That's so interesting. I know that also was the case at Sulcher's Delight too, another sort of really rare habitat area.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, does anybody have any questions? You can put them in the chat now, or you could raise your hand. Lynn?
I might have missed it, but you mentioned how the pitcher plants were removed from that one location. And why was that?
So Nature Conservancy made the decision to remove them from Cranesville Swamp because they were not natural to Cranesville Swamp. So they were planted from New Jersey. We've made the management decision for Suitland Bog to leave them there. We do occasionally have to manage them because they get kind of aggressive in Suitland Bog, but we kind of see them like the ponies of Assateague. They're one of the draws to Suitland Bog. So.
Sweet.
Okay, we have a question from Kate. You mentioned that threadleaf sundew is introduced. Where from? Where are they native to?
Yeah, so Suitland Bog, we think that the threadleaf sundew that showed up at Suitland Bog probably came in with the pitcher plants, and those were directly from New Jersey. So, and I feel like there might have been a couple other, like 2 or 3 other threadleaf sundew records here in Maryland, but I don't know where they came from.
Man, New Jersey, really killing us here.
Yeah, you could go to the Pine Barrens. Pine Barrens also have a lot of carnivorous.
They're really cool. Yeah. Okay, Stephanie asks, you showed that the native Sarracenia is squat, correct? I think I've only seen the tall S. flava or hybrids. Is that typical at this point?
Yeah, so the Sarracenia purpurea is a pretty squat Sarracenia. So that's the one that's native to Maryland. But as you go south, like in Virginia, the Sarracenia flava is native to coastal Virginia and points south. And they're the ones that are typically the taller, more trumpety shaped ones. There are some small Sarracenias, like one of them is like a little tiny red Sarracenia that you can see down in the green swamp, but it doesn't have that fat vase like you see with purpurea. They're tiny, but they're the long tubes like you would see with the flava. So yeah.
Nice. Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to ask? You can also ask just by unmuting as well.
I'd like to make the comment that Lise Crafton had mentioned, because I'd like to emphasize it. I was surprised to hear that Maryland has no real bogs, that it's fens. And I did not know that. That was a good factoid, Carrie.
Yeah, but
Learn something every day.
Cleveland Fen doesn't have the same ring.
Yeah, it doesn't.
So, yeah.
Unfortunately, yeah. Bog is just, I mean, fen is a beautiful word. Bog is just like a really fun word. You know, it does
Yeah.
nice stuff.
And a bog witch hits different than a fen.
It does. Yeah,
So.
it's just not quite the same. Exactly. Okay, well, if no one has any other questions, we can give Kerry another round of applause. Thank you so much. And you can stick around if you'd like for some chapter information if you want to find out about some more events that we're holding. You can join us again. So if you are sticking with us here, you can hear a little bit about some of our chapter events and updates. For August and September, for Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay, we have a loaded schedule here. You can check these out on our event calendar, which is chesapeakebay.wildones.org/events. We have some really cool stuff, some great native plant sales and plant swaps. Also some great events for kids at the front yard at Lettertown Library. And the Friends of Patuxent Pollinator Festival at the Patuxent Research Refuge on September 26th, which I'm very excited about because I'm a huge fan of the refuge, and so is all of our wild ones. Let's see here. It's also some national updates. Just to point out that we won't be having a garden chat in September. We will instead be tabling at the best stormwater practices for your backyard at Calvert Library on Tuesday, September 22nd. As far as national events, there's some really cool national webinars coming up that you can check out also on our event calendar and sign up for. These are virtual webinar or virtual talks that are from some big names. So it's really cool to watch. And then in some other news, this is the UME Natives at Noon series. We have a few more dates coming up here through November, and this has been a really awesome series. You can learn so much just at this short webinar, 12 to 1 p.m., first Wednesday of each month. Last time we talked about the new Maryland Extension Native Plant Finder. We also wanted to highlight the Mount Cuba Native Plant Finder. You can check out the QR code to access that. It's really fun to look through. And if there's any other questions or discussion that people want to have, just let us know. Thanks again, everybody who's still hanging on, and we're really glad that you came tonight.